today. This should be good stuff. Usually takes a second to jump over to LinkedIn, so I'm going to give it a second. But if you are joining me live, thank you so much for jumping on. All right. So I have watched, reviewed, and been on a ton of podcast episodes, definitely over 1,000. And so I've seen some really great podcast guests, and I've seen a few guests that really stumble and are honestly kind of hard to watch. And so normally I'm talking about podcasting and how to be a good host and all of that. But I thought I'd mix it up a little bit with some things I've noticed about podcast guests, because podcast guesting can be an amazing way to get your perspective out there. But if you're boring, if you're not standing out, then it's really tough to get the value out of being a guest on a podcast. And so today I'm going to share 3 secrets that I've seen the best podcast guests have, people that stand out. Because, after all of these podcast interviews that I have reviewed, that I've watched, there are very few where I'm like, wow, that was a great episode. And I'm specifically talking about B2B podcasts. It's one thing, on if you're reaching the consumer market, that's kind of a whole different world. But in the B2B space, there's a lot of pitfalls that podcast guests tend to fall into. And so we're going to cover some of those. And the first one is preparation. So many times when people are getting ready to go on a podcast, they just hop on and kind of take things as they go. And you're not always going to get the question sets ahead of time. A lot of times I'm encouraging the hosts that I work with to send the questions ahead of time, especially if you're working with a podcast guest who isn't on podcasts all the time. But as a guest, you might not always have that opportunity to see the questions ahead. So if you've gotten the questions ahead, absolutely read through them, and everything like that. But even if you didn't get the questions ahead of time, there's probably 3 to 5 questions that you're almost definitely going to get. And so just know what those questions are based on your industry, your area of expertise. If you haven't been on a lot of podcasts, so you haven't gotten the reps, so you know what those questions are, then maybe go back and review a few episodes of the person's podcast you're going to be on, so you get an idea of what they're going to ask. And so, yeah, definitely make sure that you're prepped with an answer for those questions. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to come across as completely canned and, just reading this off of a script. But at the same time, if you could ask the question and then your response to every question is, wow, that's a great question. And then you pause and you wait and then you answer the question. It's clear at that point, if you're a listener, that the person didn't really prepare effectively. And I'm saying that because I've seen a lot of podcast guests do that, but also I have been that person myself, where you're going in and you get asked a question you weren't expecting, and then you got to come up with something to buy some time to think about it. So prepping for the questions you're going to get is one piece of it. There's one question that I recommend hosts don't ask, but most podcasts do ask some variation of this question. And so one question you absolutely have to be prepared to answer is, tell me about yourself, or how did you get to where you are today, or tell me about your background and your work history. I hate those questions because they're so open-ended. As a guest, it's very hard to have a good formulated answer if you haven't taken the time to prepare. And so make sure, if you're going to go on a podcast, that you've thought through what parts of your past, your work history, your personal history that you want to highlight, and make sure that you've prepped a really great answer to that question. In an ideal world, you're going to be able to answer about your background and what you're doing in 15 to 30 seconds. If it's going longer than that, you're absolutely losing people, and you're not going to be that interesting of a guest. I've seen people go on for like 3 to 5 minutes, sometimes even longer, answering this question. And I hate to break it to you, you're not that interesting. Your background's not that interesting. If it's longer than 15 to 30 seconds, unless your story is unbelievably interesting and unique, nobody's going to care. So part one of preparation is the questions. The other part is that you got to know what you want to get out of the episode. what you want to get across. And so, are you promoting a campaign? Is there a book of yours that you've written that you're promoting? Are you coming up with a product launch or something like that that you want to get across? Those are all things that you need to decide ahead of time and have a really clear idea of what your call to action is going to be throughout the episode and at the end of the episode, so that when you go in, you know exactly what it is that you want to get across. And so that's really the preparation piece. And, it could look like going and reviewing that podcast, but ultimately, once you've done it, once you've been on a lot of podcasts, it's really just understanding what are the likely things you're going to be asked and be prepared. Now, one thing that is absolutely vital, and this is the second thing that I've seen really helps people to stand out, is to tell stories. Now, everybody talks about story in marketing, and it's taken me a really long time to wrap my head around what that actually means and what it looks like in practice to tell great stories. It's something that I'm still working on myself, and I'm trying to work through. But telling stories is absolutely the thing that's going to help you stand out. So, what most people think when they're going into a podcast episode is that people want to know your thoughts. They want to know, um, you know, the strategies, tactics, philosophy. And so the majority of podcast episodes that I review, people are spending almost the entire time talking about either their background and their history, or they're talking about strategies, tactics, philosophy. But the thing that stands out more than anything else is if you can tell a really great story. And so the way that you can do this is by saying something like, let me give you an example. And so, for me, maybe I'm on a podcast talking about podcasting, and somebody goes, well, you know, are people really going to come on a podcast if if it's your first episode and nobody's ever been on before? My default would be to answer that question by going, oh yeah, of course, here's all these different ways that we do it, here's the tactics behind it, here's the strategies. But instead, if my response is, let me give you an example. I was working with a client in an industry. It was actually one of the hardest industries that I've ever worked on before. And he did cold outreach through email, through sending out cold snail mail, by sending packages in the mail. He's getting really creative with his cold outreach for 2 months, and he booked zero demos out of it. I spent 90 minutes with him showing him how to do basic outreach for his show. And 2 hours later, he reached back out to me and said, I've already booked 2 guests for my show. And by the following week, we had our meeting on a Friday. The following Monday, he'd already had 7 people booked on his show. And his industry has been absolutely one of the most difficult ones that I've worked with so far. And so, absolutely, yes, you were going to be able to get people booked on your show. And here's some of the tactics for doing that. And so if you structure your answers that way, then instead of leading in with the tactic and losing people, you lead in with the story that's going to hook them in. And then you share the strategy or tactic that ties into that story. And so the way that you do this in practice as a podcast guest is you go in understanding some of the questions you might be asked, and then have the idea that you want to share around that, the philosophy, strategy, tactic, but then always have a story prepared, or have multiple stories prepared to answer a question. And that way you're spending, 25, 30% of your time telling the story that illustrates, and then getting into the strategy or tactic. And honestly, this is the thing that sets the best podcast guests apart from everybody else, is they're constantly looking for ways to insert stories. And they tend to tell like 4, 5, 6 stories. And then the last note on this before we move on, because I had a podcast guest not that long ago who really blew me away. I mean, best podcast guest that I think I've ever had on this on any of my shows. His name is Derek Kenny. You'll have to check him out. But he just did such a great job at constantly going, let me give you an example, or here's a way that could look in practice. And then he would either tell a real life story, or the other thing you could do is have a scenario that you share. I'm not as good at doing that as he is, so you'll have to check out his episode with me, where he does a great job at that. But essentially, when he was trying to explain the way that you should communicate, instead of telling even a personal story or a client story, which are great, and instead of going straight into a strategy or tactic, he goes, um, let me share an example with you. And then he gives this scenario where he walks through, this fake scenario where his tactic would be applied. It made a lot of sense. It really helped me to visualize it. And then after he's done sharing that example, then he walks through the steps to actually make that happen. So you got to go in prepared. You got to be ready to tell stories. And then the final piece of it is you got to be interesting. And um, if you stay monotone through your whole episode, you could be as prepared as possible, have great answers. You could have great questions. But if you're sharing in a monotone voice and you're bringing no personality, you're not bringing any personal stories, the likelihood of people remembering anything that you said is going to be extremely low. And so before you go into your podcast, before you go in for the podcast interview, get your energy level up. What does it take for you to do that? I don't know. Maybe you strike the Superman pose, you psych yourself up, listen to some uh, hardcore music. I don't know what it takes for you to get your energy level up, but go into the podcast episode with energy. Now, I'm not saying that you should be like bouncing off the walls, but at the same time, a little bit more energy than you would normally have goes a long way. Um, and I've been in marketing and around storytelling and everything like that for a while now. And you always hear people talk about stories. And then the other thing that always comes up is people talking about authenticity. Oh, you just have to be authentic. But then my question is, well, what if you're authentically boring? What do you do then? And so I don't really love the word authentic, especially when it comes to video content, because the reality is for me, I tend to drop into a monotone voice. I tend to talk in a really boring way. And so what has to happen is I have to authentically change the way I communicate, or nobody's going to pay attention to what I have to say. And so a couple of practical things you could do to be more interesting is, like I said, bring energy. The other one is to really work on vocal variety. So instead of going into an episode where you're just kind of talking in your normal voice, if I'm talking to somebody in a coffee shop, I might, be talking kind of like this, and I'm going to be sharing my story, and I'll go, man, let me give you an example. This is really great. Um, but I'm going to stick in this monotone voice. That's kind of what me personally, I naturally go to. So if you're like that, you have to figure out how to inject vocal variety. So instead, you got to go a little bit higher pitch sometimes. You got to go a little lower sometimes. You have to speed up and talk really fast, and then you have to slow it down and talk a little bit slower. Sometimes you're going to emphasize by going really quickly and adding a bunch of energy and going high and going low and doing that quickly. And then other times you need to intentionally pause. And either way, you can really emphasize a point, either by going fast or going slow. But if you add in extra vocal variety, if you add in a little bit more expression than you would normally have, you're going to stand out, and it's going to be a much more interesting podcast interview. And now that I've gotten to be around hosts who are really good, who are hosting top podcasts, they have a persona when they're on camera. And I don't really consider it to be inauthentic, but they've just recognized that there's a little bit of acting involved. Like, I'm staring into a camera right now. I'm not talking to a person. And so I can't read somebody else's body language. I can't pull off of the energy of a crowd. And so then you have to kind of fake it. You have to act a little bit. And so you have to think ahead of time when you're listening to a podcast episode, what makes it interesting when you're listening to the person, and then add a little bit of that in. So anyway, I know I'm kind of going long on that, but adding in a little bit of a variety goes a super long way. And then the last piece of being interesting is adding a little bit of your personality, or something about your personal life. And so I have 4 kids. We homeschool. I live up in the woods on a hill, and I have a YouTube channel where I cut trees up and cut logs and build things out of the logs and burn things. And so, in a podcast interview, I'm always going to try to pull something in from the personal side that people can connect to me as a person, kind of detached from whatever strategy or tactic. Just because when you connect with somebody on a personal level, again, they're just way more likely to be memorable. So yeah, those are my 3 secrets. Be prepared. No questions are going to be asked, and come in prepared with a focus for the episode. Number 2 was telling stories and really focusing on stories. And then number 3 is you got to be more interesting. Add some vocal variety. Add a little bit more emotion. Give a little bit more facial expression than you normally would. And by doing those things, you're going to stand out way more as a podcast guest than if you just default to telling your strategies and tactics in a monotone way and pausing between every question that the host asks because you have to gather your thoughts. Go ahead and do that at a time. If you follow these 3 secrets that the best podcast guests know, you're going to get more podcast guesting opportunities and you're going to get way more mileage out of the podcast that you go on. Thanks for tuning in for this episode, and I will see you next time.